Sometimes we reach for help in our darkest moments, not knowing whose hand we're grasping. We've all felt cornered, desperate for someone to stand beside us when the world feels too heavy to bear alone. In the coastal village of Raudvik, Ylva faced that exact moment when her former betrothed Egil wouldn't leave her be. In desperation, she grabbed the hand of a tall stranger walking past the longhouses. She begged him to play along, to help her escape without shame. But this stranger was Hroar Skullsplitter, a warrior banished years ago for brutal vengeance. His name alone once sent villages into hiding. Now he had returned under oath of peace, wanting only to pass through quietly. But Ylva's touch and fearless eyes stirred something he thought was buried forever. As whispers spread and Egil plots revenge, Hroar faces a choice. What happens when the most feared man in 3 kingdoms decides some things are worth fighting for? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the fjord like memories that refused to fade, wrapping the village of Raudvik in a shroud of grey that matched the weathered wood of its longhouses. Here, where the sea met ancient stones carved with runes older than living memory, life moved with the steady rhythm of tides and seasons. The salt air carried more than the scent of kelp and fish. It carried whispers, stories, and judgments that shaped every soul who drew breath in this place. Ylva Eriksdottir had learned long ago that in a village where everyone knew your grandmother's sins and your father's debts, privacy was as rare as summer snow. She clutched her mother's silver pendant, a delicate piece worked with intricate knotwork that had been passed down through 5 generations of women who had each faced their own moments of choosing between safety and freedom. The pendant rested against her heart now as she made her way through the narrow paths between the longhouses, her woolen cloak pulled tight against the morning chill. At 23, Ylva possessed the kind of quiet strength that comes from weathering storms, both literal and figurative. Her auburn hair, braided with ribbons her sister had woven, caught the pale sunlight that managed to pierce the coastal fog. Her green eyes held depths that spoke of nights spent watching over sick animals, days spent learning the healing arts from the village wise woman, and years spent deflecting the advances of men who saw her more as a prize to be won than a person to be known. The broken betrothal to Egil Thorson had been the talk of Raudvik for 3 full moons now, in a community where marriages were often arranged to strengthen family alliances and secure trade partnerships. Her decision to refuse his final offer had sent ripples through every household. Some whispered that she was too proud, too particular. Others, mostly the older women who remembered their own struggles for agency, quietly admired her courage while publicly maintaining their disapproval. Egil himself had not taken the rejection with the grace expected of a man with ties to Chieftain Olaf's inner circle. Where once his courtship had been persistent but respectful, it had turned demanding, then bitter. He appeared wherever she went, at the well, the market, even outside the small wooden church where she sought solace in prayer. His presence felt like a shadow that threatened to darken every path she tried to walk. The village of Raudvik sprawled along the curved shoreline like a necklace of timber and stone. The chieftain's great hall dominated the highest ground, its dragon-carved peaks reaching toward the sky in defiant display of power and prosperity. Below it, the homes of prominent families clustered in orderly rows, their walls thick and their hearths always warm. Further down, near the docks where fishing boats bobbed like sleeping seabirds, the smaller dwellings of fishermen, craftsmen, and traders created a maze of workshops, storage sheds, and common areas where children played between the legs of working adults. The harbour itself was the heart of Raudvik's prosperity. Trade ships from distant lands brought amber from the eastern forests, silver from mountain mines, and silk from kingdoms so far away their names sounded like poetry. In return, they carried away the village's finest goods, woolen cloth dyed with local berries, carved bone combs that were treasured by noble women, and preserved fish that could sustain a crew through the longest voyages. Ylva's father, Eric the Weaver, had built their family's modest prosperity through skill and patience. His looms produced cloth so fine that even the chieftain's wife wore his work to important ceremonies. Their home, nestled between the market square and the path to the healing woman's hut, reflected his careful nature, every beam fitted precisely, every stone in the foundation chosen for both strength and beauty. Her mother, Astrid, had died 3 winters past, leaving behind not just the silver pendant, but a legacy of quiet rebellion. Astrid had been known for speaking her mind in council meetings, for teaching young women to read runes, and for believing that a woman's worth extended far beyond her ability to bear sons and manage a household. It was from Astrid that Ylva had inherited both her healing knowledge and her stubborn independence. The village elders, 5 men and 2 women who had seen enough seasons to remember when the current chieftain's grandfather ruled, often gathered in the shadow of the great oak tree that stood at Raudvik's center. Their conversations, conducted in voices that carried just far enough to ensure the right ears heard the right messages, shaped public opinion like wind shapes waves. They had watched Ylva grow from a curious child into a capable woman, and their feelings about her situation with Egil were decidedly mixed. Thorvald the elder, whose beard had gone white as sea foam, believed strongly in tradition and viewed her refusal as dangerous precedent. "When young women start choosing their own paths," he would mutter over his evening ale, "the whole order of things begins to crack like ice in spring." But Gudrun, the wise woman, whose own marriage had been arranged to a man who treated her more like livestock than a partner, saw something different in Ylva's choice. She had taken the young woman as an apprentice not just in the healing arts, but in the more subtle art of surviving as a woman with her own mind, in a world that preferred women without opinions. The morning Ylva's life would change forever began like any other. She rose before dawn to check on old Bjorn's injured horse, prepared healing poultices for the blacksmith's wife who suffered from joint pain, and helped her father sort the colored threads for his latest commission. The routines of daily life provided comfort, a sense of purpose that made the uncertainty about her future feel manageable. But even routine days in Raudvik held undercurrents of tension. Egil had been seen speaking with his cousin Magnus, a man known for solving problems with his fists rather than his words. The chieftain's household had been unusually busy, with messengers arriving at odd hours and hushed conversations ending abruptly when servants approached. Something was stirring in the wider world beyond their village, though the nature of that something remained hidden behind the careful silence of those in power. As Ylva made her way toward the market square that morning, she could feel the weight of watching eyes. The village women gathering water at the central well paused their conversations as she passed. The fishermen mending nets on the dock glanced up from their work. Even the children seemed to sense that she represented something larger than herself, a test of how much change their community could absorb without losing the foundations that had sustained them through countless generations. The stranger's arrival had been noted by the watchman at first light. He was tall, taller than any man in Raudvik, with shoulders broad enough to carry burdens that would break lesser men. His cloak was travel-worn but well-made, and he carried himself with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to being the most dangerous person in any room he entered. But what struck the observers most was his deliberate effort to avoid attention. He kept his hood up, his eyes down, and his pace steady but unhurried. Beneath his cloak, wrapped in oiled leather and bound with leather cords, lay the weapon that had earned him his fearsome reputation. The battle-axe bore no decorative carvings or silver inlays. Its beauty lay in its perfect functionality, the balance that allowed devastating strikes, the edge that had been honed to razor sharpness through years of careful maintenance, and the dark stains that no amount of cleaning could completely remove. It was a tool of war, carried by a man trying desperately to become something else. Hroar had spent the early morning hours walking the perimeter of Raudvik, noting defensive positions, escape routes, and the general mood of the populace. Old habits died hard, and situational awareness had kept him alive through campaigns that had claimed the lives of stronger, braver men. He told himself this reconnaissance was merely prudent caution, but truth was more complex. Part of him was evaluating whether this village represented the kind of place where a man might finally lay down his weapons and find peace. The path that would bring Ylva and Hroar together wound through the heart of Raudvik, past the workshops where craftsmen were already busy at their trades, beyond the small shrine where villagers left offerings for favorable weather, and around the corner where Egil waited with the patient persistence of a hunter who had spotted his prey. In these final moments before their worlds collided, both Ylva and Hroar were thinking about escape from the suffocating expectations of a life she had not chosen. He, from a reputation that followed him like smoke follows fire. Neither could have imagined that salvation would come through the simple act of reaching for help from a stranger whose own story was far more complicated than the peaceful passage he sought. The morning sun had climbed high enough to burn away the last wisps of coastal fog when Ylva stepped around the corner near Bjorn's workshop and found herself face to face with the confrontation she had been dreading for weeks. Egil stood, blocking the narrow path between the longhouses, his broad frame casting a shadow that seemed to swallow the light around him. His dark hair was freshly braided, his clothes clean and well-fitted. He had clearly prepared for this encounter with the same attention he might give to an important trade negotiation. Ylva. His voice carried the forced calm of a man working hard to control his temper. We need to speak. She clutched her basket of healing herbs tighter, her knuckles white against the woven handles. I believe we said everything that needed saying 3 moons ago, Egil. My answer has not changed. Your answer was hasty, made in grief, perhaps, still mourning your mother's passing. His tone suggested reasonable concern, but his eyes held something harder. I've spoken with your father. He agrees that you've had sufficient time to reconsider. The words hit her like a physical blow. Her father, quiet, gentle Eric, who had always supported her choices, had been discussing her future behind her back. The betrayal cut deeper than any harsh word Egil might have spoken. My father speaks for his own heart, she said, proud that her voice remained steady. He does not speak for mine. Egil stepped closer, close enough that she could smell the pine soap he used, could see the small scar above his left eyebrow from a childhood accident she remembered from their youth. They had grown up in the same village, played the same games, learned the same stories. That shared history should have created fondness, but instead it felt like chains. Your heart, he spoke the words with the dismissive tone usually reserved for children's fairy tales. A luxury for merchants' daughters and chieftains' wives. You are the daughter of a weaver, Ylva. A good man, but not wealthy enough to indulge his daughter's romantic notions. The insult to her father sparked anger that burned away her carefully maintained composure. My father has provided well for his family through honest work. We need no charity from you, or your connections to the chieftain. No charity, Egil agreed, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. But protection, perhaps. The world beyond Raudvik is growing dangerous, trade routes threatened by raiders, neighboring clans testing boundaries. A woman? Alone? I am not alone. I have my family, my work, my place in this community. Your place. His laugh held no humor. Your place is what the community decides it is, and the community grows tired of your defiance. They whisper, Ylva, about your pride, your stubbornness, about how your mother's strange ideas infected you like a sickness. The mention of her mother crossed a line that even Egil's privileged position could not protect him from crossing. Ylva's green eyes flashed with fury, and for a moment she looked so much like Astrid in her righteous anger that several onlookers unconsciously stepped back. You will not speak of my mother. I speak truth. She filled your head with notions about women choosing their own paths, making their own decisions. Look where such ideas led her buried young, leaving her family vulnerable. The cruel implication that her mother's independence had somehow caused her death from fever was both illogical and devastating. Ylva felt her carefully constructed defenses crumbling under the weight of grief and rage. Behind Egil, she could see his cousin Magnus and two other men she recognized from the chieftain's household. This was not a chance encounter, it was a planned demonstration of force, a public claiming that would make any further refusal seem not just unwise, but impossible. The small crowd that had gathered pretended to go about their morning business, while keeping ears tuned to every word. Old Thorvald nodded approvingly at Egil's words. Several young women watched with expressions caught between sympathy and relief that they were not the ones being pressed into such a corner. The fishermen continued mending their nets, but their work had slowed significantly. The chieftain has suggested, Egil continued, his voice now carrying the weight of official authority, that unsettled situations create unrest in the community. He believes strongly in the value of stable households, proper marriages, clear lines of family obligation. It was a threat wrapped in diplomatic language. Refuse again, and not only Ylva but her entire family might find themselves facing the chieftain's displeasure. In a village where prosperity depended on the leader's goodwill, such displeasure could mean the difference between security and destitution. Ylva's mind raced through her dwindling options. She could submit, accept the marriage, and spend the rest of her life wondering what she might have become if she had possessed the courage to fight. She could continue refusing and watch her family pay the price for her defiance, or she could find some third path, some unexpected solution that might preserve both her freedom and their safety. That was when she noticed the tall figure approaching from the direction of the harbour, a stranger, travel-worn but moving with purposeful stride. His hood was up, his face shadowed, but something about his bearing suggested capability, the kind of man who might understand the art of extracting oneself from impossible situations. Desperation makes unlikely allies of strangers. Without allowing herself time to consider the wisdom of her actions, Ylva stepped away from Egil and directly toward the approaching figure. Her hand shot out, fingers closing around a wrist that felt like steel wrapped in leather. "My beloved." The words tumbled out in a rush of feigned relief and carefully performed affection. "I was beginning to worry you might not return in time for the harvest festival." The stranger stopped, his hooded head turning toward her with what might have been surprise or calculation. For a heartbeat that felt like an eternity, Ylva stared up into shadows that completely concealed his features. Then he spoke, his voice deep as winter thunder, carrying an accent that marked him as someone from far northern territories. "Forgive my delay, little dove. The journey took longer than expected." His free hand came up to rest gently on hers, where she gripped his wrist. The gesture appeared tender to watching eyes, but Ylva could feel the controlled strength in those fingers, strength that could crush bones or cradle injured birds with equal precision. Egil's face had gone through a series of expressions: confusion, anger, calculation, and finally a cold fury that promised future consequences. "I was not aware," he said carefully, "that Ylva had formed any attachments during her time of mourning." The stranger turned to face Egil fully, and though his features remained hidden beneath the hood, something in his posture made Magnus unconsciously reach for the knife at his belt. "Grief makes some bonds stronger," the stranger replied in that same deep voice. "Distance travelled to honor them more precious." It was masterfully done, an explanation that accounted for secrecy without explicitly claiming any specific relationship. Ylva felt a flutter of hope that perhaps this desperate gamble might actually succeed. But Egil was no fool, and his position in the community gave him confidence to push harder than wisdom might suggest. "I find it curious that no one in Raudvik has heard mention of this attachment. In a village where all news travels quickly, surely such an important relationship would have been noted." The stranger's reply was soft, almost conversational, but every person present felt the sudden change in atmosphere. It was as if winter had arrived without warning, turning summer air into something that burned the lungs. "Perhaps," he said quietly, "the people of Raudvik have learned the wisdom of not inquiring too closely into matters that do not concern them." The words carried an undertone of threat, so subtle and so absolute that even Magnus stepped back involuntarily. Whatever this stranger's background, it clearly included experiences that had taught him how to make dangerous men reconsider their choices. Ylva felt the shift as well, and for the first time since grabbing the stranger's hand, she wondered if she had traded one form of danger for something far more perilous. The silence that followed the stranger's words stretched like a bowstring drawn to its breaking point. Egil's face had darkened to the color of storm clouds, while Magnus and the other men from the chieftain's household exchanged glances that spoke of uncertainty and calculation. The watching villagers had gone completely still, sensing that whatever was unfolding before them carried implications far beyond a simple dispute over marriage arrangements. Ylva could feel her heart hammering against her ribs, each beat seeming to echo the rhythm of her mother's silver pendant, where it rested against her chest. The stranger's hand still covered hers, where she gripped his wrist, and she could sense the coiled tension in his arm, like a predator at rest, but ready to explode into deadly motion at the first sign of threat. "I believe," Egil said carefully, his voice carrying the forced diplomacy of a man who had suddenly found himself in deeper waters than expected, "that introductions are in order. If this man has formed an attachment to one of our village daughters, surely it would be proper for him to present himself to her family to seek the appropriate permissions." It was a clever trap. In the formal structure of Viking society, any legitimate suitor would indeed be expected to approach the woman's father, present his credentials, demonstrate his ability to provide for a family. Failure to follow these customs would mark him as either ignorant of proper behavior or deliberately flouting community standards. The stranger released Ylva's hand and reached up to lower his hood. The gesture was performed with deliberate calm, but she caught a glimpse of his expression before he turned to face Egil directly, resignation mixed with something that might have been regret. When the hood fell back, a collective intake of breath rippled through the gathered crowd. The man was indeed tall, as they had already observed, but his face carried the kind of scars that spoke of battles survived rather than simple accidents overcome. A thin white line ran from his left temple to his jaw. Another marked his forehead just above his right eyebrow. His dark hair was streaked with premature silver, braided in the northern fashion, but without the ornamental beads that marked high status. But it was his eyes that caused the fishermen to step back and the village women to pull their children closer. They were the pale grey of winter ice, and they held depths that seemed to contain the memory of things best left unspoken. "I am called Hroar," he said simply, offering no family name, no place of origin, no credentials that might ease the growing tension. The name hit the crowd like a physical blow. Conversations died mid-sentence, tools stopped moving in craftsmen's hands. Even the children seemed to sense that something momentous had just occurred, though they lacked the knowledge to understand exactly what. Old Thorvald was the first to find his voice, though it emerged as barely more than a whisper. "Hroar Skullsplitter." It was not a question but a recognition, spoken with the kind of awe usually reserved for encounters with legendary creatures that most people hoped never to meet in person. Stories of Hroar's deeds had travelled far beyond the battlefields where they occurred, growing in the telling until they took on mythic proportions. Tales of single combat against impossible odds, of strategic brilliance that turned certain defeat into devastating victory, of vengeance so complete and terrible that entire bloodlines had chosen exile rather than face his wrath. Ylva felt the world tilt beneath her feet as understanding crashed over her like a cold wave. The hand she had grabbed in desperation belonged to one of the most feared warriors in the known world, a man whose very name was used to frighten children into obedience, whose reputation was so dark that his presence in any community was considered an omen of coming violence. "The Oathbreaker," Magnus whispered, his hand now openly resting on his weapon's hilt. "The Kinslayer." Hroar's expression did not change, but something in his stillness suggested that Magnus was walking very close to a line that should not be crossed. "The man seeking passage through your village in peace," he corrected quietly. Egil had recovered from his initial shock and was now calculating furiously. The presence of Hroar Skullsplitter in Raudvik changed everything, but it also presented opportunities for a man clever enough to recognize them. If he could position himself as the village's protector against this legendary threat, his status would rise considerably. "Peace," Egil repeated, investing the word with skepticism. "An interesting choice for a man whose name is synonymous with warfare and bloodshed." "Men change," Hroar replied simply. "Or they try to." "Do they?" Egil's voice carried the tone of a prosecutor presenting evidence. "The stories tell of a warrior who burned 3 villages to avenge a personal insult, who tracked his enemies across 2 kingdoms and left none alive to carry word of his coming, who broke sacred oaths when they became inconvenient to his purposes. Each accusation landed like a blow, and Ylva could see the effect they had on the watching crowd. Fear was replacing curiosity, suspicion overwhelming any initial sympathy they might have felt for her situation. "The stories tell many things," Hroar acknowledged. "Some true, some embellished, some invented entirely by men who were not present for the events they describe. I have come to Raudvik seeking only passage to the northern settlements. I carry no weapons openly, threaten no one, and wish only to complete my journey in peace." It was masterfully done, neither confirming nor denying the stories, but positioning himself as a traveller rather than a threat. But Ylva could see that the crowd was not entirely convinced, and Egil was clearly preparing to press his advantage. "And yet," Egil continued, "you now claim attachment to one of our women. Convenient timing for such a revelation, don't you think? Almost as if it were a deception designed to serve some immediate purpose." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a signal fire. If Hroar admitted that his relationship with Ylva was false, she would be exposed as a liar and placed in an even more vulnerable position than before. If he maintained the deception, he would be forced to remain in Raudvik far longer than his plans allowed, drawing unwanted attention and potentially placing the entire community in danger. Ylva found herself caught between terror at what she had unleashed and admiration for the impossible position into which circumstance had forced this legendary warrior. She could see him weighing options, calculating consequences, searching for a path that might preserve both her safety and his own objectives. "My relationship with Ylva is recent," he said finally, "formed during my last passage through these lands, when she showed kindness to a traveller who had little reason to expect it. Such gestures create bonds that distance cannot break." Again, it was perfectly crafted, providing explanation without specific details, creating plausible backstory without claims that could be easily disproven. But Ylva could see the cost of these careful words in the tension around his eyes, the way his shoulders had set themselves for potential violence. The crowd stirred uneasily, torn between their fear of the legendary warrior and their confusion over this unexpected development. Children pressed closer to their mothers. Men's hands drifted toward weapons they hoped they would not need to use. And in the midst of this growing tension, Ylva realized that her desperate gamble had succeeded beyond her wildest expectations and failed more catastrophically than her worst fears. She was free from Egil's immediate pressure, but she had also unleashed forces that might destroy not only her own life, but the peaceful existence of everyone she cared about. The silver pendant at her throat felt suddenly heavy, as if it carried the weight of all the choices that had led to this moment. The confrontation might have escalated into violence had not Gudrun the wise woman chosen that moment to emerge from her small dwelling at the edge of the market square. Her appearance was as timely as it was deliberate. The old woman had been watching the scene unfold from her doorway, reading the currents of tension with the skill of someone who had spent decades navigating the treacherous waters of village politics. "Hroar Ironhand," she called out, using a name that predated his more fearsome reputation. I thought I recognized that northern accent. Every eye turned to the elderly woman as she approached with the careful dignity of age and earned respect. Her grey hair was braided with coloured ribbons that marked her status as a keeper of healing knowledge, and her weathered hands carried a walking staff carved with protective runes. "Gudrun," Hroar replied, and for the first time since lowering his hood, genuine warmth entered his voice. "It has been many seasons. 7 winters since you brought young Sven back to us after the raiders took him," she confirmed, her words causing another stir among the villagers. "The boy's family still speaks your name in their evening prayers." This revelation transformed the atmosphere as dramatically as Hroar's identity had darkened it. The story of Sven's rescue was known throughout Raudvik, how raiders had taken the blacksmith's youngest son during a coastal raid, how a stranger had tracked them for 3 days and returned the boy unharmed, asking nothing in return except a meal and directions to the next settlement. That the stranger had been Hroar Skullsplitter cast the familiar tale in an entirely new light. "You did not give your true name then," Gudrun observed mildly. "Names carry weight," Hroar replied. "Sometimes that weight serves good purposes, sometimes it does not." Egil's carefully constructed narrative was beginning to crumble under this unexpected testimony. A man who rescued kidnapped children and refused reward was harder to paint as an irredeemable villain, regardless of what other stories might say about his past. "The boy mentioned," Gudrun continued, with the relentless precision of someone determined to set the record straight, "that his rescuer bore fresh wounds from his battles with the raiders. 3 men died that night," he said, "all of them slavers who had stolen children from 7 different villages." The moral complexity of Hroar's reputation was becoming clear. Yes, he was a man capable of terrible violence. But that violence had been directed toward protecting the innocent as often as it had served darker purposes. Ylva found herself studying his profile as he spoke with Gudrun, noting details she had missed in her initial desperation. The scars on his hands that spoke of weapons practice stretching back to childhood. The way he held himself alert but not aggressive, ready but not threatening. The careful modulation of his voice when addressing the elderly woman, showing respect that seemed entirely genuine. "I remember also," Gudrun said with the air of someone delivering a final judgment, "that you asked after the healing herbs that grow in our coastal marshes, specifically when you inquired about treatments for battle sickness, the malady that strikes warriors whose souls have seen too much death." The admission hung in the air like incense in a sacred space. Battle sickness was something whispered about in veteran circles, a condition that left even the strongest fighters hollow-eyed and haunted. That Hroar would seek treatment for such a condition suggested a man trying to heal rather than one planning further violence. Magnus had grown increasingly uncomfortable during this exchange. His hand still rested on his weapon, but the justification for drawing it was evaporating with each revelation. "Old woman," he said roughly, "you speak of ancient history. This man's recent deeds are known to the gods and his own conscience," Gudrun interrupted with the authority of her years and position. "As are yours, Magnus Eriksson. Shall we discuss the widow Helga's missing chickens? Or perhaps the way you've been watering the ale at your cousin's tavern?" The implied threat was clear. If Magnus insisted on bringing up uncomfortable histories, he might find his own subjected to unwelcome scrutiny. The big man's face reddened, but he wisely chose to remain silent. Hroar seemed as surprised as anyone by this unexpected defense, but he recovered quickly. "I seek only to continue my journey northward," he said to the gathering crowd. "My presence here need cause no disturbance to your community's peace." "Your journey," Egil said, seizing on what he perceived as an opening. "How long before you depart?" It was a loaded question. answer too quickly, and Hroar would expose his relationship with Ylva as the obvious deception it was. Answer too slowly, and he risked becoming entangled in village politics in ways that could compromise his mission. Such decisions, Ylva interjected before Hroar could respond, depend on many factors: the weather, the state of the roads, personal considerations. She looked directly at Hroar as she spoke, trying to communicate her willingness to maintain their improvised alliance. Her intervention earned her a sharp look from her father, who had approached during Gudrun's testimony. Eric the Weaver's face showed the strain of a man caught between his love for his daughter and his fear of the forces she had set in motion. "Ylva," Eric said quietly, "perhaps we should speak privately about these recent developments." "There is nothing private to discuss, father," she replied, though her voice carried an undertone of apology for the position she had placed him in. "My choices are my own to make." "Your choices affect more than yourself," Egil observed coldly. "They affect your family, your community, the stability that we all depend upon for our survival." It was a threat wrapped in concern, and everyone present understood the implications. In a society where individual welfare depended entirely on community acceptance, being marked as a disruptive force could mean exile or worse. Hroar had been listening to this exchange with the focused attention of a strategist evaluating a complex battlefield. Now he spoke, his words carefully measured. "In my travels," he said, "I have learned that stability comes not from forcing unwilling partnerships, but from respecting the choices of those who contribute to a community's strength. Ylva Eriksdotter is known throughout the coastal settlements for her healing skills, her kindness to travelers, her devotion to family. These are qualities that strengthen rather than threaten any village fortunate enough to claim her." The compliment was unexpected, and Ylva felt heat rise in her cheeks. But she also recognized the strategic nature of his words. He was positioning her as a valuable community asset rather than a rebellious disruption. "Pretty words," Magnus growled, finally finding his voice again. "But words don't answer the question of your intentions. Do you plan to make Ylva your wife? Take her away from Raudvik? What security can you offer for her future?" The directness of the challenge left no room for diplomatic evasion. Hroar would have to declare his intentions publicly, creating commitments that would bind him far beyond anything he had planned when he first entered their village that morning. The demand for clarity hung in the morning air like smoke from a signal fire, impossible to ignore and visible from great distances. Hroar stood perfectly still for a long moment, his pale grey eyes moving from face to face among the gathered villagers, as if reading the currents of their expectations and fears. Ylva could see the calculation behind his expression, a warrior's assessment of terrain, allies, and potential consequences. "My intentions," he said finally, his voice carrying the weight of someone making a binding oath, "are to honor the bond that has formed between Ylva and myself, to protect her from those who would force unwanted choices upon her, and to prove that even men with dark reputations can choose to serve light purposes." The words were carefully chosen, offering commitment without specific timelines, protection without promises of permanence. But they were also spoken with a sincerity that surprised even Ylva, as if the act of declaring these intentions had somehow made them real for him as well. Eric stepped forward, his weathered hands twisting the leather cord he used to tie back his greying hair when working at the loom. "Sir, I mean no disrespect to your reputation or your evident feelings for my daughter, but a father must ask practical questions. How would you provide for a family? Your travels suggest a life without permanent settlement, without the stability that marriage requires." It was a reasonable question, spoken with the careful respect one might show a dangerous animal that had thus far remained peaceful. Eric's concern for his daughter's welfare was genuine, but so was his fear of what might happen if he pressed too hard. Hroar reached beneath his travel cloak and produced a leather pouch that clinked softly with the unmistakable sound of silver coins. "I am not without means," he said simply, offering the pouch to Eric. "And my skills, properly applied, can provide sustenance in any land where honest work is valued." Eric accepted the pouch with trembling hands, his eyes widening slightly at its weight. When he loosened the drawstring and glimpsed the contents, his face went pale. The coins were of northern mint, marked with runes that identified them as payment for services rendered to kings and jarls. "This is too much," Eric whispered. "More than a weaver might earn in 5 good years." "A token of respect for Ylva's family," Hroar replied, "and evidence that I do not make promises I cannot fulfill." The display of wealth had its intended effect on the watching crowd. Men who had been prepared to dismiss a wandering warrior as a penniless vagrant now reconsidered their assessments. Women began whispering to each other about the practical advantages such a match might offer. But Egil was not so easily deterred. "Silver can be stolen as easily as earned," he observed coldly. "What proof do we have that this wealth comes from honest labor rather than raiding and pillage?" The accusation was carefully calculated to revive fears that had been temporarily calmed by Gudrun's testimony and Eric's obvious amazement at Hroar's generosity. Several villagers nodded agreement, their expressions growing troubled once more. Hroar's response was to reach into his cloak again, this time producing a piece of carved bone bearing intricate runic inscriptions. He handed it to Gudrun, who examined it with the careful attention of someone who could read the ancient symbols. "A commission token," she announced after a long moment, "from Jarl Magnus the Just, requesting escort services for merchants traveling the northern routes. The payment rate inscribed here matches the silver shown." She looked up at Hroar with something approaching approval. "Dangerous work, but honorable. Protecting trade routes from bandits and raiders serves the good of all communities." The revelation shifted the balance once more. Escort services for merchant caravans were indeed dangerous. The mortality rate among guards was notoriously high, but they represented legitimate employment that commanded high wages precisely because of the risks involved. Ylva felt a strange mixture of relief and confusion. Relief that the man she had chosen as her unlikely savior was proving himself worthy of her desperate trust. Confusion because she was beginning to realize that their improvised alliance was creating real emotional complications neither of them had anticipated. "Protection services," Magnus sneered, though his earlier confidence was clearly shaken. "A polite name for hired killing. All trades require specific skills," Hroar replied with dangerous quiet. "A smith works metal, a fisherman harvests the sea, a warrior protects those who cannot protect themselves. The morality lies not in the skill itself, but in how it is applied." Old Thorvald, who had remained silent through most of the exchange, finally spoke up. "In my youth, I sailed with traders on the eastern routes. Bandits were a constant threat. Good men died because escort services were too expensive for small merchant ventures." He studied Hroar with the analytical gaze of someone reassessing long-held assumptions. "If you have kept trade routes safe, you have served purposes larger than your own profit." The elder's grudging approval carried significant weight in a community where respect for age and experience ran deep. Several younger men who had been prepared to follow Magnus and Egil's lead began reconsidering their positions. But Egil had not exhausted his weapons. "Noble purposes and reformed character make for inspiring stories," he said, with the tone of a man delivering a final argument. "But they do not address the immediate question of Ylva's welfare. This man admits to a life of constant travel, dangerous employment, and uncertain futures. What woman would choose such instability over the security of an established household in her home village?" The question was directed at Ylva herself, forcing her to declare her own preferences publicly. It was a masterful stroke. Either she would admit that the relationship was false, exposing herself to humiliation and punishment, or she would have to claim that she preferred uncertainty with a legendary warrior to security with a prosperous local man. All eyes turned to her, and Ylva felt the weight of not only her own future, but potentially Hroar's safety resting on her next words. She could see in his expression that he was prepared to release her from their improvised bargain if she chose to step back. The offer was there in his eyes. He would find some way to extricate himself from the situation without exposing her deception. But as she looked around at the faces of the people she had grown up among, she realized that something fundamental had changed in the past hour. The comfortable familiarity of village life no longer felt welcoming. It felt constraining, suffocating, like a cage whose bars had become visible only when the possibility of freedom presented itself. "A woman," she said clearly, her voice carrying across the square, "might choose uncertainty, with a man who respects her choices over security, with one who would make her choices for her." The words fell into silence so complete that the sound of waves against the distant shore became audible. Even the children had stopped their playing to stare at this unprecedented display of female independence. Egil's face darkened with fury that he could no longer entirely conceal. "You risk everything," he said in a voice like winter wind. "Your family's position, your community's stability, your own future security. For what? The fleeting attention of a man whose reputation is built on violence and whose loyalty extends only as far as his next commission?" "I risk everything," Ylva agreed, "for the chance to discover what I might become if I am allowed to choose my own path." The evening that followed the morning's confrontation settled over Raudvik like a heavy blanket, muffling conversations and forcing the village to grapple with the implications of what had occurred. Ylva sat in her father's workshop, watching him work by candlelight as he had done countless nights throughout her childhood. But tonight, the familiar rhythm of his shuttle moving through the loom's threads felt different, charged with tension and unspoken questions. "The silver he showed," Eric said finally, his voice carefully neutral. "It was more than I expected." Ylva looked up from the healing herbs she was sorting, her hands stilling in their work. "Does that change your feelings about the situation?" "It changes the practical considerations," her father replied, choosing his words with the precision of a man walking through a field of hidden traps. "Security matters, daughter. Your mother would have wanted you to be practical as well as independent." The mention of her mother brought a sharp pang of longing. Astrid would have understood the impossible position Ylva now found herself in, committed to a deception that was becoming more complex with each passing hour, bound to a man whose reputation preceded him like thunder before lightning. "What did mother tell you?" Ylva asked quietly, when her father tried to arrange her marriage to Olaf Grimson. Eric's hands paused in their work, the shuttle suspended between threads like a pendulum marking time. The story was family legend how Astrid had refused the chieftain's son despite the enormous political and economic advantages the match would have provided. "She told me," Eric said slowly, "that she would rather be poor with a man she could respect than wealthy with one she could not. But she also knew that I could provide for her, protect her, give her a life worth living. This stranger—" "Has a name," Ylva interrupted gently. "Hroar. And he has shown more consideration for my choices in one morning than Egil has in 3 moons of courtship." "Hroar Skullsplitter," Eric corrected, and the fearsome epithet hung between them like a blade. "A man whose legend was forged in blood and whose presence brings danger wherever he goes." "A man who rescued Sven when no one else would risk the attempt," Ylva countered. "A man who seeks treatment for battle sickness rather than glorying in his violent past." They sat in silence for a long while, father and daughter each lost in their own thoughts about futures suddenly made uncertain. Outside, the sounds of village life continued, dogs barking, children being called in for evening meals, the distant laughter of men gathering at the tavern. But it all felt muted, as if the community itself was holding its breath. A soft knock at the door interrupted their contemplation. Eric rose to answer it, revealing Gudrun standing in the doorway with her medicine bag slung over one shoulder. "I thought," the old woman said with gentle authority, "that Ylva might benefit from some counsel about the path she has chosen to walk." Ylva felt relief flood through her. If anyone in Raudvik could provide wisdom about navigating impossible situations, it would be the woman who had served as midwife, healer, and unofficial counselor for 3 generations of village families. Eric retreated to the far side of the workshop, ostensibly to continue his weaving, but actually to provide the women with privacy for their conversation. Gudrun settled herself on the wooden stool beside Ylva's work table, her rheumatic joints protesting the movement with soft sounds of complaint. "You have set forces in motion," Gudrun observed without preamble. "That will be difficult to control." "I know," Ylva replied simply. "But the alternative was to surrender my freedom entirely." "Freedom," the old woman repeated thoughtfully, "is not the same thing as escape. True freedom requires understanding the consequences of your choices and accepting responsibility for them." Ylva's hands resumed their sorting of herbs, the familiar task providing comfort during an increasingly uncomfortable conversation. "What consequences do you see that I have not already considered?" "Hroar Skullsplitter did not earn his reputation through acts of kindness," Gudrun said bluntly. "The stories speak of a man capable of terrible violence when provoked. Are you prepared to share your life with such a person? The stories also speak of his protection of the innocent, his loyalty to those who treat him fairly. Sven's rescue proves that his violence is not indiscriminate. Does it? Or does it prove only that he is capable of choosing when to apply his lethal skills? The question, child, is whether you trust his judgment about when violence is necessary." It was a sobering thought. Ylva realized she had been so focused on escaping Egil's unwanted attentions that she had given little consideration to what life might actually be like with a man whose reputation was built on his ability to kill efficiently. "You knew him before," Ylva said, "when he rescued Sven. What was your impression?" Gudrun was quiet for a long moment, her weathered fingers tracing patterns on the table's wooden surface. "Haunted," she said finally, "like a man carrying burdens too heavy for any one person to bear. He spoke little, asked for nothing beyond basic directions, and left payment for the meal he was given, even though it was freely offered. But his eyes," she paused, searching for the right words. "His eyes held depths that suggested he had seen things that would break lesser men. And now? This morning, when you saw him again, the haunting remains, but there was something else. When he looked at you, when he spoke of honoring the bond between you, there was a spark of something I had not seen in him before. Hope, perhaps, or the possibility of redemption." Ylva felt something flutter in her chest, a mixture of fear and exhilaration that she was not quite ready to examine too closely. "You think he spoke truly when he claimed attachment to me?" "I think," Gudrun said carefully, "that what began as performance may be becoming something more substantial. The question is whether you are prepared for such a transformation." Before Ylva could respond, another knock sounded at the door. This time it was Hroar himself, appearing out of the gathering dusk like a manifestation of their conversation. Eric answered the door with obvious reluctance, but courtesy demanded that he invite the visitor inside. Hroar entered with the careful movements of someone acutely aware that his presence might be seen as threatening. He had changed from his travel clothes into a clean tunic and trousers that, while simple, were of good quality and fit him well. His hair had been freshly braided, and Ylva noticed that he had taken care to ensure his weapons were not visible. "Gudrun," he said with genuine warmth, bowing slightly to the elderly woman. "Thank you for your words this morning. They carried more weight than my own could have managed." "Truth carries its own weight," she replied diplomatically. "I merely spoke what I had observed." Hroar turned to Eric with the formal courtesy of a man seeking to make a good impression. "Master Eric, I hoped we might speak about your daughter's future, and about how I might prove my worthiness to be considered as part of that future." The directness of his approach was refreshing after hours of indirect conversation and careful implication. Eric set down his shuttle and faced his unexpected guest with the dignity of a man determined to meet whatever fate had brought to his door. "Speak, then," Eric said simply, "but understand that pretty words will not be sufficient. If you seek my daughter's hand, you must prove that you can protect not only her body but her heart, not only her present but her future." It was a father's challenge, spoken with quiet authority and backed by deep love. Hroar accepted it with the solemnity of a knight receiving a sacred quest. 3 days after the confrontation in the market square, a messenger arrived in Raudvik, bearing news that would transform everything the villagers thought they understood about their situation. The young man rode a lathered horse and wore the colours of Chieftain Olaf's household, his face grim with the weight of urgent tidings. Ylva was tending to old Bjorn's injured mare when the commotion began. Shouts echoed across the village as people emerged from their workshops and homes to hear what message could be so important as to require such haste. She left the horse with a poultice of healing herbs and hurried toward the great hall, her heart already beginning to race with premonitions of disaster. The messenger stood before Chieftain Olaf's great wooden throne, his chest heaving from exertion as he delivered his report to the assembled village elders. His words carried across the hall with crystalline clarity, each syllable dropping into the silence like stones into still water. Jarl Sigurd the Black has declared blood feud against all who shelter the oathbreaker Hroar Skullsplitter. His war band numbers more than 200 men, and they have already burned 3 settlements that refuse to surrender the fugitive. They are 2 days' march from Raudvik, moving along the coastal road. The pronouncement hit the gathered crowd like a physical blow. Conversations erupted in panicked whispers as the implications became clear. Harbouring Hroar was no longer a matter of village politics or personal choice. It had become a question of survival. Chieftain Olaf rose from his throne, his weathered face grave with the weight of leadership in crisis. What crime does Jarl Sigurd claim justifies such extreme measures? The murder of his son Harold during a dispute over payment for escort services, the messenger replied. Jarl Sigurd claims that Hroar killed the young man in cold blood when Harold questioned the warrior's competence after losing several merchants to bandits. Ylva felt the world tilt beneath her feet as understanding crashed over her. The commission token Hroar had shown, the one that proved his legitimate employment, it had been issued by the very man whose son he was accused of murdering. The silver in his purse was not payment for services rendered, but wages earned through treachery. Around the hall, she could see the same realization dawning on other faces. The respect Hroar had carefully built through 3 days of courteous behavior was crumbling like a sandcastle before the tide. Whispered conversations were already beginning, voices speaking of betrayal, of the danger they had all been placed in by harboring a kinslayer. Egil stepped forward, his face showing no surprise at the messenger's news. "I warned this community that the stranger could not be trusted. Now we see the price of ignoring such warnings." His words carried the weight of prophecy fulfilled, and Ylva realized with sick certainty that Egil had somehow known this revelation was coming. The timing was too convenient, his lack of surprise too obvious. He had been waiting for this moment, perhaps even orchestrated it. "You knew," she said, her voice cutting through the growing tumult. "You knew about Jarl Sigurd's pursuit." Egil turned to face her with the calm satisfaction of a hunter whose trap had finally been sprung. "I knew that men with reputations like Hroar Skullsplitter do not change their nature simply because they claim to seek peace. I sent inquiries to contacts in the northern settlements, asking about any recent activities involving our unexpected guest. The admission confirmed Ylva's worst suspicions. While she and Hroar had been building their improvised alliance, Egil had been systematically investigating and undermining it. His cousin Magnus stepped forward to stand beside him, making their united front clear to everyone present. "The question now," Magnus announced loudly, is whether Raudvik will protect itself by surrendering this murderer to justice, or whether we will allow our entire community to be destroyed, defending a man who has brought nothing but deception and danger. It was masterfully done, framing the choice as one between communal survival and misguided loyalty to an outsider. Ylva could see heads nodding throughout the crowd, fear overcoming whatever sympathy they might have felt for Hroar's situation. Chieftain Olaf raised his hand for silence, his authority temporarily restoring order to the chaotic discussions. Where is the accused? He should be given opportunity to answer these charges before we make decisions about his fate. Here! Hroar's voice came from the great hall's entrance, where he stood silhouetted against the afternoon light. He had obviously been listening to the proceedings, and his expression showed no surprise at the accusations being leveled against him. He walked into the hall with the same measured pace he had maintained since arriving in Raudvik, his hands visible and empty of weapons. But there was something different about his bearing. Now the careful diplomacy was gone, replaced by the stark honesty of a man who had decided that concealment was no longer possible. The charges, he said simply, are true. The confession sent another ripple of shock through the assembled villagers. Several women pulled their children closer, and more than one man's hand moved instinctively toward concealed weapons. I killed Harald Sigurdsson, Hroar continued, his voice carrying easily to every corner of the hall. But the circumstances were not as his father claims. Chieftain Olaf leaned forward in his throne, his expression unreadable. Explain. Harald was not questioning my competence. He was demanding that I abandon the merchant caravan to pursue bandits who had taken village children as slaves. When I refused to abandon my sworn duty to protect the merchants, he drew his sword and attacked me. The explanation cast the killing in a different light, but Ylva could see that it would make little difference to Jarl Sigurd's pursuit. A father's grief for his dead son would not be lessened by arguments about the justification for the killing. You should have told us, Eric said from where he stood near the back of the crowd, his voice heavy with disappointment and betrayal. You should have been honest about what you carried with you when you sought shelter here. Would it have changed anything? Hroar asked, turning to face Ylva's father directly. Would any of you have shown kindness to a man fleeing blood feud? Would Ylva have been safer from Egil's pressure if I had announced myself as a fugitive from justice? The questions hung unanswered because everyone present knew the truth. Honesty would have meant immediate exile or surrender to Jarl Sigurd's vengeance. But the deception still stung, particularly for those who had begun to believe in the possibility of his redemption. Ylva found herself caught between fury at his dishonesty and understanding of why he had chosen concealment. The man who had claimed to seek peace had been fleeing consequences of violence all along. Yet the violence itself might have been justified, the actions of a man trying to honor conflicting obligations. The immediate question, Chieftain Olaf said with the practical focus of a leader facing impossible choices, is what we do now. Jarl Sigurd's warband will arrive within 2 days. If we shelter Hroar, we face annihilation. If we surrender him, we preserve our community, but condemn a man who has harmed no one in Raudvik. A man who has brought death to our doorstep through his deceptions, Egil corrected. A man whose presence here was based entirely on lies. A man who rescued Sven from slavers, Gudrun said quietly, speaking for the first time since the messenger's arrival. A man who has shown nothing but courtesy to this community, despite the obvious cost to his own safety. The division within the village was becoming clear. Fear and pragmatism lined up behind Egil's position, while compassion and loyalty supported Gudrun's perspective. But there was a third factor that no one had yet voiced: Ylva herself, and the impossible position she now found herself in. I will not be the cause of Raudvik's destruction, Hroar announced before anyone else could speak. I will leave tonight, draw the pursuit away from innocent people who showed kindness to a stranger. And Ylva? Magnus asked with cruel precision. Will you take her with you into exile and danger, Or will you abandon the woman you claim to love now that maintaining the pretense no longer serves your purposes? The challenge forced the final truth into the open. Everything between them had begun as performance, but somewhere in the past 3 days, the lines between necessity and genuine feeling had become blurred beyond recognition. Now, facing the prospect of immediate separation, both Ylva and Hroar would have to decide what, if anything, had been real. The silence that followed Magnus's challenge stretched like a rope pulled to its breaking point. In that moment of suspended time, Ylva felt the weight of every choice she had made since grabbing Hroar's hand in desperate escape from Egil's pursuit. The pretense that had begun as pure survival was about to be tested by the harsh realities of blood, feud, and exile. Hroar's pale grey eyes found hers across the crowded hall, and in them she saw something that made her breath catch. Not calculation or performance, but genuine anguish at the thought of causing her harm. Whatever deceptions had brought them together, the concern in his expression was entirely real. "The choice," he said quietly, "must be Ylva's alone. I will not ask her to share the consequences of my actions." Before she could respond, Egil stepped forward with the confidence of a man who sensed victory within his grasp. "The choice is indeed hers, but it should be made with full knowledge of what each path offers. Remain in Raudvik with me, and she will have security, prosperity, and the protection of her community. Follow this fugitive into exile, and she will have nothing but danger, uncertainty, and the constant threat of violent death." The stark comparison was designed to make her decision obvious, but as Ylva looked around the hall at faces she had known since childhood, she realized that her choice had been made days ago. The moment she had refused to accept Egil's version of her future, she had already chosen uncertainty over security, possibility over predetermined fate. "I will go with him," she said simply, her voice carrying clearly through the hall despite its quiet tone. The announcement sent another shockwave through the gathered villagers. Eric stepped forward, his face pale with dismay and desperate parental concern. "Daughter, think carefully about what you are saying. Once you leave Raudvik under these circumstances, there may be no return. Your life here, your family, your place in this community, all of it will be lost." "Some things," Ylva replied, thinking of her mother's silver pendant where it rested against her heart, "are worth the risk of losing everything else." Gudrun moved to stand beside Eric, her weathered hand coming to rest on his shoulder in gesture of comfort and understanding. "Astrid made a similar choice once," she said softly, "when she refused Olaf Grimson despite the advantages that marriage would have brought. Some women are born to walk paths that others fear to follow." The reference to Ylva's mother brought murmurs of memory from the older villagers who recalled Astrid's independence and strength. But it also highlighted the difference between choosing an unconventional husband within the safety of community and following a fugitive into the dangerous unknown. Chieftain Olaf rose from his throne, his expression grave with the weight of leadership during crisis. "If you are both determined on this course, then preparations must be made quickly. Jarl Sigurd's warband will not be delayed by sentiment or ceremony." The practical needs of immediate departure began to crystallize around them. Food for the journey, warm clothing for the northern territories they would likely need to reach, weapons for protection against both human and natural threats. But beneath these mundane concerns lay the deeper emotional complexity of saying goodbye to the only life Ylva had ever known. Hroar approached Eric with the formal courtesy he had maintained despite the circumstances. "I know that words cannot compensate for taking your daughter from you, but I swear by all the gods that I will protect her with my life, honor her choices, and ensure that she never regrets the courage she has shown." Eric studied the man who was about to become his daughter's companion in exile, searching for some reassurance that this desperate gamble might lead to happiness rather than destruction. "You speak of protection and honor," he said finally, "but can you speak of love? Can you promise that what began as necessity has become something worthy of the sacrifice she is making?" The directness of the question caught Hroar off guard. For a moment, the careful control he had maintained throughout the crisis slipped, revealing something raw and vulnerable beneath his warrior's composure. "I cannot promise love," he said honestly. "What lies between your daughter and myself is too new, too complicated by circumstances to name with certainty. But I can promise respect, dedication, and the hope that given time and peace, something genuine might grow from roots planted in desperate soil." It was not the declaration of passion that romantic tales would have demanded, but it carried the ring of truth that made it more convincing than pretty lies would have been. Eric nodded slowly, accepting, if not entirely approving, the honesty of the response. As the villagers began to disperse to make their various preparations, Egil approached with his cousin Magnus and 2 other men from the chieftain's household. His expression had hardened beyond disappointment into something approaching hatred. "You will not make it past the first settlement," he said to Hroar with quiet venom. "Jarl Sigurd's reach extends far beyond his own territory. Every village, every trading post, every safe harbour will be closed to you once word spreads of the bounty on your head." "Perhaps," Hroar replied mildly, "but that is no longer your concern. It becomes my concern when you corrupt one of our women with false promises and impossible dreams." Egil's voice was rising, drawing attention from those who had not yet left the hall. "When your selfishness destroys a young woman's life for the sake of your own convenience." The accusation struck close enough to Hroar's own fears to provoke a response that was anything but mild. "Careful," he said, his tone dropping to barely above a whisper, while somehow becoming more audible throughout the hall. "You speak of corruption and false promises, as if your own courtship was marked by honesty and respect for the lady's preferences." "My courtship offered her a future worth having," Egil shot back. "Security, status, children raised in safety rather than exile. What future can you offer beyond running and hiding until Jarl Sigurd's men finally track you down?" "The future she chooses for herself," Hroar replied simply, "rather than the one you would impose upon her." Magnus stepped forward, his hand openly resting on his sword hilt. Pretty words from a man who has built his entire reputation on violence and deception. How long before those same qualities destroy the woman foolish enough to trust them? The threat implicit in Magnus's posture was unmistakable, but before Hroar could respond, Ylva moved to stand between them. Her presence transformed the dynamic instantly. What had been building toward a confrontation between warriors became something far more complex and dangerous. "Enough," she said, her voice carrying an authority that surprised even herself. "I have made my choice freely, with full knowledge of the risks involved. Any man who claims to act in my best interests while ignoring my clearly expressed preferences serves only his own wounded pride." The rebuke was delivered with such calm precision that even Magnus stepped back, recognizing that to press the confrontation further would mean threatening a woman who had committed no crime beyond refusing unwanted attention. But Egil was beyond such restraint. "You will regret this decision," he said, addressing Ylva directly for the first time since her announcement. "When winter comes and you find yourself hunted and homeless, when your children are born in caves and raised in constant fear, remember that you chose hardship over happiness, uncertainty over security. And when I am free to wake each morning and decide for myself what that day will bring," Ylva replied, "I will remember that the choice was mine to make." As evening descended on Raudvik, the village buzzed with preparations for the departure that would take place before dawn. Supplies were gathered, farewells were planned, and weapons were quietly sharpened against the possibility that Jarl Sigurd's war band might arrive sooner than expected. In her father's workshop, Ylva packed the few possessions she could carry: her mother's silver pendant, a small bag of healing herbs, the warm cloak her sister had woven for her last birthday. Each item represented connections that would soon be severed, memories that would have to sustain her through whatever trials lay ahead. Hroar spent the evening hours checking his equipment with the methodical care of a professional warrior. His battle-worn axe was examined, sharpened, and secured in its leather wrappings. His bow was restrung and tested. His travel gear was organized with the efficiency of someone who had fled from dangerous situations before. But as midnight approached and the time for departure drew near, both Ylva and Hroar found themselves grappling with the same fundamental question. Were they running towards something meaningful together, or simply running away from impossible situations separately while happening to travel in the same direction? The answer would determine not only their immediate survival, but the foundations upon which any future relationship might be built. In less than 6 hours, they would begin a journey that would test every assumption they had made about themselves, each other, and the nature of the bond that had formed between them in just 5 turbulent days. Dawn broke grey and cold over Raudvik as Ylva made her final preparations for departure. The village lay wrapped in morning mist that seemed to muffle not only sound but emotion, as if the very air was reluctant to witness the severing of bonds that had taken a lifetime to form. She stood in the doorway of her father's workshop, watching him work the loom one last time before she would leave his protection forever. Eric's hands moved through the familiar motions of weaving, but his mind was clearly elsewhere. The shuttle passed back and forth through threads of blue and silver, creating a pattern that would outlast the daughter who would no longer be there to see it completed. "The pendant," he said without looking up from his work, "carry it with honor. Your mother would be proud of the courage you have shown, even if she might question the wisdom of your choice." Ylva touched the silver necklace where it rested against her throat, feeling the warmth it had absorbed from her skin during the long night of restless sleep. "I will remember her teachings about choosing one's own path, even when that path leads into uncertainty." A soft knock at the door announced Hroar's arrival. He entered with the quiet respect of someone acutely aware that he was intruding on a deeply personal farewell. His travel gear was arranged with military precision, weapons secured but accessible, supplies distributed for optimal weight balance, every item serving multiple purposes. "The morning watch reports no movement on the southern approach," he said quietly, "but that may change quickly once Jarl Sigurd's scouts determine that I am no longer traveling alone." The reminder of their immediate danger cast a shadow over the already somber atmosphere. Every moment they delayed increased the risk not only to themselves but to the village that had sheltered them. Eric set down his shuttle and turned to face the man who was about to take his daughter into the dangerous unknown. "I have prepared travel rations for 5 days," he said, indicating a leather satchel by the door. "And this." He lifted a bundle wrapped in oiled cloth, revealing a cloak of remarkable craftsmanship, wool so fine it seemed to shimmer, dyed in deep blue and edged with silver thread. "Father, this is too much," Ylva protested, recognizing the cloak as one of Eric's finest works, intended for sale to noble households. "It is not enough," Eric replied simply. "But it is what I can give." He turned to Hroar, with the dignity of a man facing the worst fear any parent can experience. "Keep her warm, keep her safe. And if the day comes when you cannot do both, choose safety over comfort." Hroar accepted the cloak with hands that trembled slightly, the first sign of deep emotion he had shown since his identity was revealed. "I understand the magnitude of the trust you place in me," he said formally. "It will not be misused." The sound of approaching footsteps interrupted their farewell. Gudrun appeared in the doorway, her medicine bag slung across her shoulder and her weathered face set in lines of grim determination. "I have come to offer guidance for the road ahead," she announced, stepping into the workshop uninvited. From her bag she produced a small leather pouch, its contents clinking softly, healing herbs suitable for travel. "And this." She handed Ylva a piece of carved bone bearing runic inscriptions. "A protection charm?" Ylva asked, examining the intricate symbols. Directions, Gudrun corrected, to safe houses along the northern routes, places where travelers in distress can find shelter without questions asked. Memorize the locations, then destroy the bone. Such knowledge is dangerous if it falls into the wrong hands. Hroar studied the old woman with newfound respect. You maintain networks beyond Raudvik's borders. I maintain friendships with those who value life over politics, Gudrun replied tartly. The northern settlements have need of healing knowledge, and I have need of information about the wider world. Such arrangements serve everyone's interests. The revelation that their desperate flight might not be entirely without resources brought the first glimmer of hope Ylva had felt since the messenger's arrival. But it also raised questions about how many other secrets lay hidden beneath Raudvik's peaceful surface. There is one more thing, Gudrun continued, her expression growing even more serious. Word has reached me that Jarl Sigurd's pursuit is driven by more than grief for his son. Harold carried information about planned raids on northern trading posts. Information that died with him. The implications were clear and troubling. If Hroar's killing of Harold had prevented the young man from delivering intelligence about future attacks, then the blood feud was about more than personal vengeance. It was about protecting ongoing criminal enterprises. Which means, Hroar said slowly, that surrender would not end the pursuit. Jarl Sigurd cannot allow me to reach authorities who might be interested in what Harold knew. It means your only safety lies in reaching people who value the information you possess more than they fear Sigurd's reputation, Gudrun agreed. The complexity of their situation was becoming clear. They were not simply fleeing blood feud, but carrying knowledge that multiple parties would kill to either obtain or suppress. Their journey north would be through territory where allies and enemies might be indistinguishable until the moment of revelation. As the morning light grew stronger, casting longer shadows across the workshop floor, the time for departure could no longer be delayed. Ylva embraced her father with fierce intensity, trying to memorize the feel of his arms around her, the scent of wool and wood smoke that had defined home for all of her 23 years. I will send word when I can, she promised, though they all knew that such communication might be impossible for months or even years. Live well, Eric replied. Live freely. And remember that you carry my love with you wherever the road may lead. They left Raudvik as the morning mist still clung to the fjord, two figures moving swiftly along paths that would soon carry them beyond the protective embrace of familiar territory. Hroar led with the sure-footed confidence of someone who had navigated hostile terrain many times before, while Ylva followed with the determined grace of a woman who had chosen her destiny with full knowledge of its costs. The first hour passed in relative silence. Both of them focused on putting distance between themselves and the village before Jarl Sigurd's warband arrived. But as they climbed into the hills that bordered Raudvik's coastal plain, the reality of their situation began to assert itself with uncomfortable clarity. There is something you should know, Hroar said as they paused beside a stream to refill their water containers, about the path we must travel and the dangers it contains. Ylva looked up from where she knelt beside the clear water, noting the tension in his voice. More dangers than a warband of 200 men seeking our lives? Different dangers, he replied carefully. The northern route passes through territories where law is enforced by strength alone, where travelers are evaluated based on their ability to defend themselves rather than their intentions or character. The warning was delivered with the matter-of-fact tone of someone stating obvious realities, but Ylva could hear the deeper concern beneath his words. In leaving the protective boundaries of civilized settlement, she was entering a world where her healing skills and gentle nature would provide no security against those who took what they wanted by force. You fear I will be a burden, she said, not as accusation but as simple observation. Hroar considered his answer with visible care. I fear that my need to protect you may compromise tactical decisions that could ensure our survival. and I fear that the harshness of the life we must live may destroy the very qualities that make you worth protecting." The honesty of his response was both painful and reassuring. He was not offering her comfortable lies about the adventure they were embarking upon, but neither was he treating her as helpless cargo to be carried along on his flight to safety. "Then we must find ways to minimize both risks," Ylva said practically. "Teach me what I need to know to defend myself, and trust me to adapt to circumstances without losing what matters most about who I am." The sound of horses approaching from the south cut short any reply Hroar might have made. They were still within sight of the coastal road, and the riders moving along it bore the colours and weapons of a scouting force sent ahead of a larger army. "Jarl Sigurd's advance guard," Hroar observed with grim satisfaction, "moving faster than expected, but not fast enough." They withdrew deeper into the hills, using terrain and vegetation to screen their movement from the horsemen below. But as they climbed higher, Ylva began to understand the true scope of the pursuit they faced. Smoke rose from multiple points along the coast, signal fires that would allow coordinated tracking across vast distances. "They are not simply following our trail," she realized. "They are driving us toward predetermined capture points." Sigurd did not become a successful Jarl through impulsive action, Hroar agreed. "He has planned this campaign with the same care he would use against any military objective." The systematic nature of their enemy's approach was both frightening and oddly encouraging. If Jarl Sigurd was treating their capture as a military operation, it suggested that he recognized Hroar as a formidable opponent rather than mere prey to be run down. As afternoon shadows began to lengthen, they reached a ridge that offered clear views of the territory they would need to cross. Below them, a river valley provided the most direct route north, but it also offered multiple opportunities for ambush. The alternative was a longer path through mountain passes that would be slower but more defensible. "The choice," Hroar said, settling beside a large boulder that provided both rest and concealment, "depends on whether we prioritize speed or security. If we can reach the northern settlements before Sigurd's net closes completely, the direct route serves our purposes. If we are likely to face interception regardless, the mountain path offers better opportunities for defense." Ylva studied the landscape with eyes trained by a lifetime of reading weather patterns and seasonal changes. "The mountain route will be impassable within a month when the first snows arrive. If we become trapped in high country when winter sets in, we die slowly instead of quickly," Hroar finished grimly. The brutal calculus of survival was becoming clear. They faced not one but multiple threats that would require different strategies to overcome. Immediate pursuit demanded speed and stealth. The approaching winter required reaching safety before weather made travel impossible. And the longer-term challenge of building a life together required finding territory where they could establish some measure of security. "There is a third option," Ylva said slowly, an idea forming as she spoke. "What if we do not run north at all?" Hroar turned to look at her with sharp attention. "Explain." "Gudrun's safe houses extend along the northern routes because that is where travelers usually flee when seeking to escape southern authorities. But what if we traveled east instead, toward the trading posts near the mountain passes? Sigurd's forces will be concentrated along the coastal roads where they expect to find us." The suggestion showed tactical thinking that impressed Hroar despite the desperate circumstances. An unexpected change of direction could indeed throw off their pursuers, at least temporarily. "The eastern routes are more dangerous," he warned. "Less law, fewer friendly settlements, greater distances between safe harbors." "But also greater freedom to disappear entirely," Ylva countered. "And if we are going to build a life together away from everything we have known, perhaps it is better to embrace the unknown completely, rather than seeking familiar comforts in unfamiliar places." The choice would determine not only their immediate survival, but the fundamental character of whatever future they might build together. 6 months later, as spring began to touch the eastern mountains with tentative warmth, Ylva stood in the doorway of their small cabin and watched Hroar return from the trading post with supplies and news from the wider world. The winter had been harsh but survivable, testing both their individual resolve and their growing partnership in ways that comfortable village life never could have managed. The cabin itself represented their combined efforts, his knowledge of construction and defense, her understanding of herbs and healing, their shared determination to create something lasting from the desperate choices that had brought them together. It sat in a mountain meadow that provided both concealment and access to the trade routes that connected the eastern settlements. Jarl Sigurd's warband disbanded 3 moons ago, Hroar reported as he set down his pack and began sorting through the supplies he had purchased. Word reached him that his son had been involved in planning raids against merchant caravans. The blood feud was quietly abandoned when the political cost became too high. Ylva felt a weight she had grown accustomed to carrying suddenly lift from her shoulders. The constant awareness of pursuit, the careful attention to approaches and escape routes, the nightly fear that dawn might bring discovery, all of it could finally be set aside. "We are free to return to Raudvik if we choose," she said, testing the possibility aloud. Hroar paused in his sorting to look at her directly. "Would you choose that? To go back to the life you knew before?" The question carried depths that went far beyond simple geographical preference. Over the months of their shared exile, what had begun as mutual dependence had gradually transformed into something more complex and more genuine. They had learned to read each other's moods, to anticipate each other's needs, to find comfort in shared silence and joy in small discoveries. "I would choose to have the option," Ylva replied carefully, "but not necessarily to exercise it. This life we have built together, it has its own value, separate from the circumstances that created it." During the long winter evenings, they had talked extensively about their pasts, their regrets, their hopes for whatever future they might build together. Hroar had spoken of his years as a warrior, the weight of lives taken and lives lost, the gradual realization that skill in warfare was not the same thing as wisdom in living. Ylva had shared her memories of her mother's strength, her struggles with Egil's pressure, her dreams of using her healing knowledge to help people beyond the boundaries of a single village. "I have been thinking," Hroar said as he organized the purchased supplies into their proper storage places, "about the trading post's offer to hire us as permanent residents. They need someone with healing knowledge for the seasonal influx of travelers, and someone with my background to help organize their defenses against raiders." The proposal had been made several times over the winter as word spread about their skills and reliability. The trading post occupied a strategic position along mountain routes that connected several kingdoms, serving as neutral ground where merchants from different territories could conduct business safely. "It would mean staying here permanently," Ylva observed, "making this place our home by choice rather than necessity." "It would mean many things," Hroar agreed, "including the opportunity to marry properly, if that is something you would welcome." The suggestion was delivered with characteristic directness, but Ylva could see the uncertainty in his expression. What had begun as performance had evolved into genuine affection, but the question of formal commitment had remained unspoken through all their months of partnership. "Is that a proposal?" she asked with gentle humor. "It is an inquiry about whether a proposal might be welcome," he replied with matching lightness. "I have learned the wisdom of understanding a woman's preferences before making assumptions about her desires." Ylva crossed the cabin to stand beside him, close enough to see the silver threading through his dark hair, close enough to note the new lines around his eyes that spoke of laughter as well as hardship. The fearsome reputation that had first terrified her was still there, but it no longer defined him completely. "A formal proposal might be very welcome," she said softly, "from a man who has proven that his word can be trusted, his strength can be gentle, and his heart can be touched by love as well as duty." When Hroar kissed her, it was with the careful intensity of someone who had learned not to take precious things for granted. The silver pendant at her throat caught the afternoon light as he held her, a reminder of the mother who had taught her to value freedom even when it came at great cost. Later that evening, as they sat together planning their future as permanent residents of the trading post community, Ylva received an unexpected gift. A traveling merchant brought a letter from Eric, written in the careful script she remembered from childhood lessons. Her father reported that Raudvik was prosperous, that Egil had eventually married a merchant's daughter from a neighboring village, that Gudrun continued her healing work with no sign of slowing despite her advancing years. Most importantly, the letter concluded with Eric's blessing for whatever life his daughter had chosen to build in the eastern mountains. "Your mother's pendant," he wrote, "was meant to be worn by a woman brave enough to forge her own path. I am proud that it rests with someone who has honored its legacy." As spring turned towards summer and they prepared for the formal wedding that would bind them not just to each other but to their chosen community, Ylva often found herself reflecting on the desperate morning when she had grabbed the hand of a dangerous stranger. That moment of terrified improvisation had led to a life richer and more complex than any she could have imagined in the safety of familiar routines. Sometimes the best choices, she had learned, were the ones that required the greatest courage to make.